Stefano Delle, Portrait of a Black Terrorist. Black Papers No. 1. By Stuart Christie. First published in Britain in 1984 by Anarchy magazine and Refract Publications. Page 33, Chapter 5, Spanish Interlude. Borghese and Delle were welcomed to Spain by numerous friends of the Black Orchestra, in particular Otto Skorzeny, the Duke of Valencia, José Antonio Girón, a former Franco minister who provided them with accommodation at his villa in Fuengirola, and Mariano Sánchez Cavazza, an influential Madrid businessman and father of the notorious guerrillas of Christ the King, the Spanish death squads. Spain was to provide new opportunities for Stefano Delle with his special skills, his considerable influence over his friendship circle and his small army of dedicated followers in both Italy and Spain. His leadership qualities were immediately recognized by Skorzeny, who took him under his wing as his protégé. Skorzeny's business operations also provided useful cover for the real life's work of Delle, which was now entering a new and more international phase. The Paladin Organization. The spirit of contestation which marked the late 60s and early 70s throughout the Western world inspired a resurgence in the activities of the anti-Francoist movement in Spain. The terrorist campaign initiated by the Basque separatist organization EDA was a particularly aggravating thorn in the flesh of the dictatorship. Obsessed with the threat of communism and inspired by the ideas of SAS founder David Stirling, Skorzeny had, since the early 50s, been toying with the idea of setting up an international directorship of strategic assault personnel whose terms of reference would enable it to straddle the watershed between the paramilitary operations carried out by the troops in uniform and the political warfare which is conducted by civilian agents. Letter from David Stirling to Charles Foley published in the latter's book on Skorzeny, Commando Extraordinary. The political turbulence and rapid polarization of Western society which began in the mid-60s in the wake of the Third World liberation movements and, in particular, the example of the Vietnam War, convinced Skorzeny that the time was ripe to put his ideas into practice, just as Stirling was doing in Britain with his Watchguard organization with which he hoped to counter communist-inspired anti-government forces and maintain the status quo for the West, with the tide of unrest growing in intensity month by month and the increasing number of guerrilla actions against military and political pillars of the Franco regime, both at home and abroad, Skorzeny was given a free hand by the Spanish Interior Ministry to deal with the thorny but delicate problem of neutralizing the perceived enemies of Francoism. In 1968 he began recruiting former Waffen-SS and OAS men for this purpose. French Nazi Party leader Françoise Dior signed up many members of her organization who were then taken to San Sebastian to be interviewed by Skorzeny, who informed them they would be called upon when Franco died if the army did not manage to take control. Other recruits were found primarily among the ranks of former members of the OAS, the later outlawed Service d'Action Civique, SAC, as well as South Tyrolean and exiled Yugoslav fascists, anti-Castro Cubans, and Portuguese exile fascists. The day-to-day running of the Paladin Organization, as it was named, was entrusted by Skorzeny to an old colleague from the Third Reich, Dr. Gerhard Hartmut von Schubert. Von Schubert, if that indeed was his real name, was, like many other leading figures among the old guard of the Black Orchestra, an ex-employee of Goebbels' propaganda ministry. After the war he had been security advisor to the vicious Perón dictatorship in Argentina, then after that a principal agent in Skorzeny's construction of the Gestapo-style Egyptian security services under Negib and Nasser. The public face of the Paladin Organization was that of a legitimate security consultancy, but this was only to provide cover for its real function of recruiting mercenaries and killers for dictators and failing colonialist regimes. Its covert activities in France and Spain were carried out under a variety of convenient names: Spanish Basque Battalions, the Guerrillas of Christ the King, the Apostolic Anti-Communist Alliance, etc. Murder of Serrata. The arrival of Delle and his army of dedicated followers boosted the ranks of Paladin and marked the beginning of a bloodthirsty and ruthless campaign of murder and terror directed against exiled dissidents and enemies of the regime. Under cover of the confusing variety of names, this neo-fascist sub-state agency has organized and carried out well over 1,000 punitive attacks in Spain and the French border area, particularly around Bayonne, killed around 50 people and seriously wounded many hundreds more. Aldo Tissé, the neo-fascist supergrass who took over the military organization of the Delle group in Italy following its leader's move to Spain, later informed investigating magistrates, we eliminated EDA members who had fled to France and did so on behalf of the Spanish Secret Services. *. Footnote. Delle made at least 3 trips to Greece during the course of 1971, accompanied by Yves Garin-Sirac, Guido Giannettini, and a number of others, including Bruno Stefano and Gianni Nardi, both later implicated in the Calabrese murder. The purpose of these trips was to attend courses in urban guerrilla and psychological warfare organized by the KYP/CIA front organization World Service. End footnote. The murderer of the almost legendary anarchist Laureano Serrata Santos, Ramon Bonico Canada, may also have been working with the Paladin organization. The frame-up of 11 anarchists in France following the kidnapping of Spanish banker Balthazar Suarez in May 1974 also appears to have involved at least one Paladin provocateur by the name of Martinez. Paladin did not work solely for the Francoist security agency, it carried out contracts on behalf of numerous other sub-fascist regimes and agencies as well. Supergrass Aldo Tisse elaborated, we had solid and highly effective links of a political as well as an operational nature with some foreign secret services, among whom I may name, without fear of contradiction, the Chilean DINA and the Spanish Secret Services up to Franco's death. They also supplied us with superb logistical backup and helped find us effective assistance in the event of our going on the run. Obviously these services wanted favors in return. On DINA's behalf we carried out the attack on the chairman of the exiled Chilean Christian Democrats, Bernardo Leighton, and his wife. On behalf of the Spanish we have, as I said, eliminated runaway EDA terrorists who had fled from Spain. Tisse also went into some detail about the role of Delle in the Black Orchestra. This international planning and coordination is an area personally looked after by Stefano Delle, and if he were to succeed in his plans it would spell a lot of danger for the institution's sick. For in that case, the armed groups of the far right would derive massive advantages. The Brescia and Italicus train bombings. 1974 saw the restructuring of the Italian extraparliamentary right with the establishment of much closer international links with other neo-fascist movements and even more sinister umbrella organizations such as the World Anti-Communist League. The offensive was not long in coming. On May 28 the bomb exploded at an anti-fascist rally in Brescia, killing 8 and injuring 102 people. A communiqué was received shortly after claiming responsibility for the outrage on behalf of a hitherto unknown group using the name Ordine Nero. On was, in fact, just one of many names to be used by the now amalgamated Ordine Nuovo and Avanguardia Nazionale. A few months later, on August 4, another bomb exploded aboard the Rome-Munich Italicus express train near Bologna, killing 12 people and injuring 48. The date chosen for this outrage would appear not to have been random. Italian police investigating the murder of a Greek student in Rome the following February uncovered evidence that the Italicus bombing involved both Italian and Greek fascists. Costas Plevris's August 4 movement, outlawed after the overthrow of the junta in July 1974, had reorganized as a clandestine terrorist organization under the name of the Greek equivalent of the Italian Ordine Nuovo, both meaning new order. 2 years of investigation eventually led to charges being preferred against another hardline element in the Delle network, Mario Tutti, founder of the pro-Gaddafi Italian-Libyan Friendship Society. Lotta Controlua, the Italian left-wing paper, later published a story in which it claimed that a gang of right-wing policemen, the so-called Black Dragons, had been involved along with Tutti in the Italicus and other train bombings. The same article disclosed that a member of the Black Dragons, police officer Bruno Cresca, then in prison on charges of robbery, had been involved in the rocket attack on a Pan-American plane at Rome's Fiumicino airport on December 17, 1973, in which 32 people had burned to death. The attack was claimed by a hitherto unknown Palestinian People organization. Lotta Continua also published a duty roster and photograph proving Cresca had been on duty at Fiumicino on the day of the attack, although officially assigned to other duties a month before. The paper also quoted a witness who claimed to have seen the terrorists slip through a side door, ushered by a policeman in uniform, thereby evading the searches which would have led to the discovery of their weapons. Finally, Lotta Continua published a handwritten facsimile of a police interrogation of Cresca following the discovery of some 30 million lire on his person. Although incomplete, Cresca's answers appear to indicate that the money had been given to him in September 1974 in payment for work done in Rome the previous year. Does this refer to the Fiumicino attack? The arms factory in the Chiaie Pileo. Stefano Delle continued to use Spain as his base while he traveled regularly between Madrid and Rome for nearly 6 years. After the death of his protector Scorzini and General Franco in 1975, following hard on the collapse of the Portuguese and Greek dictatorships the previous year, it became increasingly obvious it was time to move on to more secure surroundings. The crunch came following a police raid in February 1977 on a clandestine arms factory in the Chiaie in Madrid, owned by another of Delle's Spanish godfathers, Mariano Sánchez Cavazza, leader of the guerrillas of Christ the King. 9 of Delle's closest associates among the Italian exiled neo-fascists were arrested in connection with this discovery, but forewarned, or lucky, both Delle and his friend Yves Garensarac, who had been in Spain organizing the counter-revolutionary Portuguese Liberation Army on behalf of General Spinola to overthrow the Progressive Armed Forces movement, managed to elude their would-be captors and once again disappeared from view. After the arms factory raid, the Spanish Ministry of the Interior issued an interesting statement regarding information uncovered as a result of the raid that the US-made Ingram M10 machine gun used in the killing in 1976 of the examining magistrate investigating the Italicus train bombing, Vittorio Accorcio, was modified and perfected by the engineer Eliodoro Pomar in the Chiaie factory. What the statement did not say was that the machine gun had been given to Stefano Delle by agents of the Guardia Civil for services rendered. Links with Mafia. Supergrass Aldo Tessè, the organizational head of the neo-fascist terrorist infrastructure in Italy following the flight abroad of the original leaders of the various terrorist groups, and one of the 2 men charged with the murder of Accorcio, has subsequently revealed the close interdependence between organized crime and the security services. Tessè revealed the real reason for the murder of Accorcio. Accorcio was the first magistrate to realize that behind our political movement, Ordine Nuovo, stood a terrorist organization with links to other foreign organizations with anti-democratic objectives. It now appears that Accorcio had uncovered links with the Masonic Lodge P2*. Footnote. In relation to the murder of Accorcio, it is interesting to note that the murderers, Concutelli and Tessè, were safe-housed in an apartment rented to them by a Rome businessman, Pietro Citti, a friend and confidant of Flavio Carboni, the Italian financier and Lodge P2 member later involved in the last tragic flight of Roberto Calvi of the Banco Ambrosiano to London. Calvi's last night alive was spent in the London home of another Freemason and relative of Carboni, Michael Morris. Pietro Citti, the Carboni front man, had close ties with Delle, to whom he had leased his apartment at Via Sartorio 5 in Rome for a hideout. It was from this hideout that the murder of Accorcio was planned and effected, with Stefano Delle's Ingram MAC-10 machine gun. Pietro Citti also appears to have been a linked man between Carboni, acting on behalf of Lodge P2, and Delle, whom he visited on occasion in Madrid. End footnote. From these links and from those with organized crime, the neo-fascists derived political protection and all the skills of the underworld necessary to pursue their activities. Also, after the Madrid arms factory raid, further investigations by the Spanish police led to the discovery of fascist leader Elio Masagrande's bank deposit box, which was found to contain large sums of foreign currency and 3 gold bars from the 1976 $25 million Nice bank robbery carried out by Albert Spaghieri, an Italian and Spanish fascist terrorists, all contract employees of the Paladin organization. Elio Masagrande and another fascist, Gaetano Orlando, managed to escape to Paraguay where, after international protest, they were both arrested in December 1977, but released again in a matter of days on the direct orders of President Stroessner. Drugs and guns. Aldo Tessè has further alleged that the Delle organization also operated as an espionage agency for an unnamed Libyan diplomat who also allegedly ran a huge heroin smuggling operation. In return for money and drugs, the neo-fascists' task was to supply the diplomat with secret information on weapons and warfare systems being manufactured and developed by the Selenia and Contraves companies, the 2 leading Italian firms in the sector. One Delle agent, Antonio Lindri, worked at Contraves, but he was murdered before he could be questioned by police. The identity of the Libyan diplomat is unknown, but Rome investigating magistrate Ferdinando Imposimato has written, many facts and discoveries prove the close links, going back to the early 70s, between the Libyan government and leading exponents of fascist subversion operating in Italy. It is no accident that one of the leading members of the Delle network, Claudio Muti, was for a long time the chairman of the Italia-Libya Association. Also, Mario Tutti, the neo-fascist killer charged with the Italicus Express bombing, is known to have cashed a check from the Libyan embassy in Rome while on the run in 1975. In 1978 Ordine Nuovo, reconstituted in 1974 as a merger between Ordine Nuovo and Avanguardia Nazionale which led to the formation of the terrorist organization Nuclei Armata Rivoluazionaria, NAR, armed revolutionary groups, issued clandestine order papers to members. These papers make it clear that the new organizational network was now international in scope and that the operational bases had been moved outside Italy. They instructed cells to use different names for each attack. One went so far as to say, after murder comes indiscriminate terrorism. Page 38, Chapter 6, in Latin America. Stefano Delle's first known visit to Latin America was to Chile with Prince Valerio Borghese late in 1973 after the CIA-backed coup which ousted and killed President Salvador Allende. The build-up to the Chilean coup bore numerous similarities to the events which unsettled Italy from early 1969 onwards. The two fascists' trip to Chile was ostensibly on behalf of a Madrid agency, Enicia, to establish friendly relations and encourage trade with the new regime, but in fact to discuss the setting up of an international hit squad to kill the enemies of the junta and to neutralize all overseas opposition. This proposal for a transnational terror network later to become known as Operation Condor was discussed and agreed with the Chilean head of station of the American CIA, Raymond Warren, responsible for running psychological warfare and paramilitary operations networks for eliminating anti-junta dissidents in other Latin American countries and in Europe. The first contract fulfilled was the murder in September 1974 of General Carlos Prats and his wife in Buenos Aires. The murder was carried out by the neo-fascist terrorist group Patria y Libertad, a network of right-wing criminals trained in Bolivia and at a school of the United States International Police Academy. Laying a false trail. In September 1975 Delle traveled to Rome on a false passport where he met Michael Townley, a sworn agent of the Chilean Secret Service, the DINA, Townley's wife, Mariana Inés Callejas, also a DINA agent, and Virgilio Paz, an anti-Castro Cuban terrorist leader. According to a statement made by Townley to the FBI, following his successful extradition to the United States from Chile on charges of having murdered exiled Chilean leader Orlando Letelier, all three met with Delle and his associates to discuss the proposed assassination of Bernardo Leighton. Within a matter of days the assassination plan was finalized. Virgilio Paz and Delle between them prepared a scenario intended to confuse the subsequent police investigation and lead it away from both DINA and the Italians. The attempt on Bernardo Leighton's life took place in Rome on October 6, 1975, but it was unsuccessful and the would-be assassins succeeded only in wounding their target. The attempt was later described to Aldo Tesse by the would-be assassin himself, Pierluigi Concutelli. Pierluigi described the operation to me down to the finest detail. He fired at Leighton's head, heard the wife scream, whirled around and wounded her in the throat. He was on the point of giving both the coup de grace but relented, convinced their deaths were imminent. Concutelli described it as the only cock-up in my life. A few days later, on October 13, the false trail was laid when the Miami-based Cuban exile paper Diario de las Americas published a communiqué from an organization calling itself Ciro which claimed responsibility for the shooting. In November a further communiqué from Ciro was received by the Miami office of the AP agency providing details of the shooting. The communiqué claimed Stefano Delle portrait of a black terrorist. Responsibility for the assassination of the Cuban exile leader Rolando Masferrer on October 31 for being a divisive influence on the Cuban exile movement, it added, Mr. Bernardo Leighton was shot through the back of the head in Rome. A 9mm Beretta pistol was used. We are informing you of this to contradict reports in the media and to identify them fully. Townley later stated to the FBI that the information used in the Ciro communiqué had been channeled by Delle to DINA in Chile and from there to Virgilio Paz in Miami. Although annoyed at the failure of the assassination attempt, DINA paid out L00 million lire to Delle which, according to Pentito Aldo Tesse, he pocketed himself. Another diplomatic murder linked with the Delle organization, under contract from Paladin, by now based in Zurich following exposure of its activities by the Parisian daily Liberation, was the murder of General Joaquin Centeno Anaya. Anaya was the American-trained Ranger commander responsible for the capture of Che Guevara in Bolivia in October 1967, and in May 1976 was the Bolivian ambassador in Paris. Although the assassination was claimed by the hitherto unknown Che Guevara Brigade, it has been suggested, Nouvel Observateur, Paris, June 1976, that it was planned by a Bolivian intelligence officer known as Saavedra with Del Che in the Hotel Consulado in Madrid. Anaya's politics were opposed to the then president, General Banzer. He was a supporter of ex-President Torres, who was murdered shortly afterwards in Argentina. It would appear, then, that when Del Che and Garransarac made their escape from Madrid in 1977, they found refuge and a new base for their activities in South America, where they already had many friends and protectors. Murder Unlimited. The original network of pro-Nazi circles in Latin America, maintained by Skorzeny, Luftwaffe hero Hans Ulrich Rudel, ex-Goebbels man Johannes von Leers and Klaus Barbie, had been built on in the late 60s by the fresh blood of Aginter press organizer Yves Garransarac and his network of OAS exiles. Many of the methods and techniques which are now the hallmark of Latin American death squads originated in the theory and practices in Algeria of the French 5th Bureau of the General Staff, Psychological Operations, under Colonel Lacheroy, and were honed to cruel perfection by the OAS under the direction of Colonel Jean Gardes, beheading, degenitalising and other forms of mutilation of suspects, and the dynamiting of their corpses and leaving the remains in some public place. Garransarac's mentors in Lisbon and Madrid, Susanai and Laguillard, were both protégés of the infamous 5th Bureau set up in 1957 during the Algerian War. In the late 60s, when Aginter Press spread its attention from Africa to Latin America, it is estimated that about 60% of Aginter personnel were recruited from the ranks of the OAS, while the remainder were recruited from neo-Nazi organizations in Western Europe such as the Frankfurt-based Kampfbund Deutscher Soldaten***. Footnote. Kampfbund Deutscher Soldaten, German Soldiers Combat League, Talstrasse 6, D6 Frankfurt am Main. Founded by Karl-Heinz Kuck and Wolfram Langer, Erwin Schönbrunn, and Dr. Eberhard Taubert. The organization, which has a membership of around 1,500 of whom 2/3 are under the age of 30, publishes the monthly Unser Kampf, Our Struggle, which is wholly controlled by Nazis. Many members of the Paladin group were recruited from the ranks of the KDS, as were many of the mercenaries who fought in Rhodesia, 39 in June, 21 in July and 34 in September 1976. The Rhodesian mercenaries were recruited and trained by Taubert's colleague Major Nicholas Lamprecht. End footnote. Run by another ex. Goebbels man and partner of von Schubert in Paladin, Dr. Eberhard Taubert, otherwise known as the Man in the White Porsche. Asterisk. Footnote. Dr. Eberhard Taubert, died November 4, 1976, joined the Nazi Party in 1931, 2 years before Hitler came to power. Promoted to Sturmführer in legal department during Goebbels' Gau leadership of Berlin, he later followed Goebbels to the Ministry of Propaganda, where he was assigned the department handling the struggle against alien ideologies, religious meddling and Bolshevism at home and abroad. Dr. Taubert later took charge of active anti-Jewish propaganda and was subsequently assigned the Anti-Comintern Bureau, which specialized in anti-communist and anti-Soviet propaganda. In 1938 Taubert was appointed judge with the Court of People's Justice. He was later made ministerial advisor to Goebbels and headed a 450-strong team of Nazi propaganda specialists in the occupied territories. After the war, Taubert went to South Africa and Iran before returning to Germany in 1950, when he was recruited into the Special Services section of the Gehlen Organization, BND. He was also appointed chairman of the CIA-backed National Association for Peace and Freedom. Under cover of the All-German Ministry, Taubert was an advisor to Franz Joseph Strauss, Minister of Defense, and to NATO on problems of psychological warfare. For over 20 years Taubert was the main source of finance to the neo-Nazi and extreme right groups in Europe, acting as a conduit for money from businesses and foundations such as the Staats- und Wirtschaftspolitischen Gesellschaft e.V. in Cologne and Peljugen AG of Frankenthal. In 1977, this company was run by former consul Dr. Fritz Reis, one of the many straw men through whom funds are channeled to Franz Joseph Strauss. According to journalist Patrice Chirov, Taubert was also one of the respected correspondents of the Greek KYP through his World Service Press Agency. Until his death in 1976, Taubert was considered. End footnote. A 1968 prospectus sent by Garransarac to the head of Guatemala's secret police tendering for a security contract makes chilling reading in the light of subsequent events. It proposed a program of action against Castroite subversion in Latin America and the placement in Guatemala of a team of specialists in subversive and revolutionary struggle, or perfectly trained politico-military cadres to serve as technical advisors in the elaboration of political and military action schemes to be pursued in the struggle. This action by specialists would be placed under the ultimate authority of local political leaders and perfectly coordinated with them. Apart from setting up a headquarters study office charged with making a special study of subversion and familiarizing officers with new combat methods of guerrilla warfare, infiltration, psychological warfare, and the setting up of a special missions center. Indeed, it would be a good idea as well to extend the anti-guerrilla action to adjacent nations, Nicaragua and El Salvador, for the anti-guerrilla struggle. In June 1971, the New York Times reported that at least 2,000 people had been murdered in Guatemala between May 1968 and November 1970. An Amnesty International report estimated that upwards of 30,000 people were murdered in the decade beginning 1966, the vast majority of them between 1968 and 1971 following the assassination of U.S. Ambassador Gordon Main. The terror campaign, modeled on the South Vietnamese Phoenix program, in which an estimated 40,000 Viet Cong suspects were murdered, was masterminded and overseen by Main's successor, Nathaniel West, a senior staff member of the U.S. National Security Council. West was afterwards appointed U.S. Ambassador to Chile in November 1971, shortly after President Allende nationalized the copper mines, and was carried out by agencies such as the plausibly deniable Ajinter Press. According to Patrice Chiroff, missions carried out by Ajinter Press and similar front agencies in Latin America enabled, by 1977, around 560 European neo-fascists to receive in-depth training and experience in psychological warfare and terrorism. Shortly before exiled Argentinian dictator Juan Perón's plane touched down at Ezeiza Airport on his return from exile to power on June 20, 1973, death squads of the AAA, Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, organized by Peronist Interior Minister Juan López Rega, later identified as a member of Lodge P2, opened fire with machine guns and threw hand grenades into the waiting crowds, massacring 300 bystanders because they were Peronist left-wingers. According to an investigation carried out by the newspaper of the leftist Montoneros, El Descamisado, those responsible for the massacre included members of several international neo-fascist groups, including François Chiaie, formerly of the Milice, the wartime Vichy French anti-resistance squads, a veteran of the OAS Delta Commandos, and heavily implicated in the international drug trade. Extensive travels. When in May 1974 investigators from the Portuguese Armed Forces movement raided the Lisbon HQ of Ajinter Press and its political wing, Order and Tradition, they discovered Yves Garransarac's last known forwarding address, Apartados 1682 Salvador. Stefano Delle's main base in Latin America appears to have been Buenos Aires, but he is known to have traveled extensively throughout Latin America in the company of one or two trusted companions. According to DINA sources quoted by American authors John Dinges and Saul Landau in their book Death on Embassy Row, Stefano Delle, using the nom de guerre Alfredo di Stefano, aka Topo Gigio, together with two Italian companions Luigi, or Gigi, and Maurizio, possibly Maurizio Giargi, a go-between for Delle and Italian Secret Service officer Antonio La Bruna, were provided with an office by DINA from which they operated a front news agency in Santiago which specialized in channeling pro-government articles to the Western media. The office consisted of a large apartment equipped as an office with a telex machine for their dispatches. As with Ajinter Press, the news agency also appears to have provided cover for covert activities. The three Italians are known to have established contacts in Bolivia, Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, El Salvador, and Guatemala, as well as in their base country, Argentina. In Buenos Aires they are known to have been in contact with DINA agent Michael Townley's militia group, closely allied to López Rega's AAA, which specialized in reprinting Nazi tracts in Spanish and promoting anti-Semitic literature as well as providing auxiliaries for the security services of Latin American dictatorships. It was the militia which assisted Townley in assassinating Chilean exiles such as General Carlos Prats. Kidnap Anonymous. Although Del Che's exact activities and movements from 1977 until 1980 are a matter for conjecture, he seems to be able to go wherever he wants, whenever he wants. What is certain is that this period saw a cementing of the relationship between the neo-fascists and organized crime, the mafia. In Italy, 1976 had witnessed an increase in the number of criminal kidnappings, and there was growing evidence that the neo-fascists, particularly those linked with the Del Che network such as Pierluigi Concutelli, were deeply involved with the activities of the so-called Kidnap Anonymous organization. It was also known that for some considerable time the mafia organizations which ran the narcotics trade in the heroin triangle, Ostia Asiliacasal Palixa, had been using the neo-fascists as heavies to distribute drugs and to intimidate addicts and neutralize investigators. It is not known whether Del Che attended the 12th Congress of the South Korean-based World Anti-Communist League * hosted by President Stroessner in Asunción, Paraguay, in 1979. Footnote: World Anti-Communist League, WACL. The most sinister of all the internationally active extreme right-wing organizations and pressure groups. Although founded in Seoul, South Korea, in 1966, the initial foundations were laid in Mexico in 1958 during the World Anti-Communist Congress for Freedom and Liberation. The WACL is based on Goebbels' Anti-Comintern and is the main conduit for funds for extreme right-wing organizations throughout the world. One of the first operations financed by the WACL shortly after its founding in November 1966 was to finance the propaganda and intelligence gathering press agency Agenter Press. End footnote. But the 400 delegates from 80 countries certainly included Del Che's close comrade from Spain, Elio Masagrande. The main subject for discussion on the agenda was how to galvanize support for right-wing regimes in the vanguard of the struggle against communism. Another more important meeting in which Del Che certainly was involved was the Secret Conference of Latin American Security and Intelligence Services held in Bogotá, Colombia, in November 1979. It was at this conference that Argentinian General Roberto Eduardo Viola, later to become President of Argentina, laid the foundations for the Argentinian-sponsored coup which blocked the accession of the newly elected President of Bolivia, Dr. Siles Zuazo, in July 1980. Edward S. Herman, The Real Terror Network, Terrorism in Fact and Propaganda, South End Press, Boston, 1982. Coca-Cola. If Del Che's precise movements are unknown to us, his activities are far from being obscure. He was traveling backwards and forwards between Argentina and Bolivia for some years and was directly involved in the destabilization campaign preceding the bloody coup which overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected president Dr. Siles Zuazo on July 17, 1980. One of the Del Che organizers in Latin America, West German Joachim Fiebelkorn, born 1947, a Paladin and Kampfbund Deutscher Soldaten veteran, as well as a Frankfurt pimp, who had worked with Del Che in Bolivia, stated later to the West German police that Del Che was the #1 international middleman between the Sicilian mafia and the Latin American cocaine producers. Based in a police barracks next to the West German embassy in the capital, La Paz, the Del Che men, Los Novios de la Muerte, the fiancés of death as they called themselves, were contracted as security guards and enforcers for the multinational drug empire of Roberto Suarez, described as the King of Coca, overseeing the production, transportation, distribution, and marketing of cocaine. It was Roberto Suarez who put up the money and placed his neo-fascist paramilitary organization at the disposal of General Luis Garcia Meza in his preparations for the 1980 coup which installed both Meza and his interior minister, the notorious Colonel Luis Arce Gomez. Arce Gomez, a close relation of Roberto Suarez, and known as the Idi Amin of the Andes, was described by the U.S. ambassador to Bolivia and by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency as one of the biggest cocaine dealers in the country after Suarez, of course. Another U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency official claimed that for the first time ever the drugs mafia has evidently bought itself a government. Bolivia, cocaine, the military connection, Latin America Regional Reports Andean Group, August 29, 1980, quoted in Edward S. Herman, The Real Terror Network. The amount of money involved in this lucrative trade can be gauged by Arce Gomez's own estimate in a statement to Latin America Weekly Report, 13. February 1981 Coca can produce for us $1,200 million. But this was a vast understatement. The astronomical profits being made can be better judged by the fact that Roberto Suarez, in an attempt to obtain the release of his son, held in the United States on serious drug charges, offered to pay off Bolivia's entire foreign debts of $3,800 million. The son has since been released on bail and is now back in Bolivia. Concerning the 1980 coup in Bolivia, Venezuelan journalist Ted Cordovalaire wrote in El Nacional, all sectors agree unanimously that Argentinian, Italian, German, and South American elements all participated in the coup effected by Garcia Meza and Colonel Arce Gomez. Many of the junta's prisoners were interrogated by Argentinians. The same writer also affirmed that the destabilization campaign was begun during the regime of Argentina's Jorge Videla, another Lodge P2 Mason, and that General Galtieri himself went to La Paz to prepare the campaign and sent at least 70 Argentinian police and security specialists who operated under cover of the newly established OPSIC, the Oficina de Operaciones Psicológicas, Office of Psychological Operations, chillingly reminiscent of the French Fifth Bureau which spawned the likes of Jean-Jacques Soussanet, Pierre Laguillard, and Guerin Serac. Writer Ed Berman puts the figure at 200 military and intelligence personnel. Los Angeles Times journalist Ray Bonner quoted one U.S. military advisor in Bolivia, "The Argentinian military did everything but tell General Garcia Meza the day to pull it off." Los Angeles Times, August 31, 1981, quoted in Edward S. Herman, "The Real Terror Network. Communists everywhere." The ostensible head of the new Bolivian regime, General Garcia Meza, charged his Interior Minister Arce Gomez with the job of setting up a personal bodyguard to protect him on his trips around the country. This force was recruited from the neo-fascists who had helped him to power. This parallel security force was trained and overseen by William Adger Moffat III, a CIA paramilitary officer who had previously helped refine the methods used by Haitian dictator Papa Doc Duvalier's dreaded murder organization, the Tun Tun Makuts. Within days of Arce Gomez's statement on taking office that all those who violate the law of national security will have to walk around with their last will and testament under their arm, the death squads had begun their campaign of bloody repression. Student meetings were broken up and activists and academics were beaten up and murdered. The headquarters of the main Bolivian trade union, the Central Obrero Boliviano, were gutted and militants tortured and murdered. One of the worst incidents was the carnage which took place at Caracol, a small tin mining community near Oruro where only a few survivors lived to tell of the atrocities committed by the fiancés of death. El Novio de la Muerte, Fiancé of Death, is a marching song of the Spanish Foreign Legion. To avoid attracting attention to themselves, the fiancés of death would drive into villages or working class areas in ambulances with red crosses marked prominently on the vehicles and carry off their victims, most of whom were never seen again. Other leading members of the fiancés of death were Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, ex-Waffen SS officer Haus Stellfield who died shortly after the coup from injecting an overdose of cocaine, ex-Waffen SS Herbert Koplan, Franz Joseph Boeffel, Hans Jürgen, Kay Gwinner, Wolfgang Walter Kirchie, the Rhodesian Manfred Kohlmann, Heinz Lauer, Hans Landowski, Karsten Wallner, Joachim Fiebelkorn. Apart from these mainly German and Austrian Nazis, there were also at least two Frenchmen, Oliver Danet and Napoleon Leclerc, the OAS man exiled from Marseilles at the end of the French Connection. Italian neo-fascist and P2 supergrass Elio Cialoni, involved later in the Bologna bombing investigations, described this motley collection in an interview published in the Italian weekly Panorama. Fiebelkorn, boss of the Bavarian operation, arrived in Santa Cruz and, little by little, built up this group of German mercenaries. First there was the middleweight boxer alias Herbert Kaplan, 52-year-old Berliner and veteran of the SS Armored Division of General Steiner. He was a POW in Russia until 1952, expert at stripping every sort of weapon. The most likable character was Hans Jürgen, formerly a railway electrician, an alcoholic who died of overdrinking. The most experienced driver was Manfred Kohlmann, a little hothead forever in a fury with Kay Gwinner, a Chilean German in exile since Allende's day. There was also the Frenchman Jean Leclerc. His real name was Napoleon Leclerc. In Algeria, with the Legion, he had carried out a lot of torture. He always strutted about in military uniform with grenades dangling at his belt. He never paid his bills and saw communists everywhere. Fiebelkorn's best friend was 65-year-old Hans Stellfield, a Gestapo veteran who fled Low South America at the end of the war. A military instructor, potter, dealer in exotic animals and drugs, he was also a bodyguard and smuggled arms from the USA. Our 9-man group was in direct touch with the Nazi HQ in La Paz run by Klaus Barbie. From the second half of 1978 onwards we had but one aim: to get ourselves organized so as to display our power. U.S. pressure. Following the success of the coup, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency estimated that the drug traffickers who had put up the $70 million to put Garcia Meza into power increased the annual production at their refineries from $2,000 million to over $7,000 million. When the U.S. authorities started to exert pressure on the Bolivian government to crack down on the production of cocaine, it simply provided Arce Gomez with an opportunity to corner the market for himself and Suarez. Having recruited the fiancés of death into the Bolivian National Drug Control Agency, Arce Gomez then provided them with a list of more than 100 of the smaller independent drug producers to be dealt with. Leading units of the Bolivian army, the Nazis raided the illegal drug factories of the smaller producers, smashed up the equipment, impounded their stocks of cocaine and forced many of them to hand over their houses, luxury flats, aeroplanes, boats, and whatever money they had. Those who resisted were tortured and killed as examples to the others. The story of Pierluigi Chiaie, a long-term confidant of Delle, illustrates the activities of the neo-fascist network in Bolivia. Chiaie, born 1954, the son of a rich Milanese family and a stalwart of Italian neo-fascism in the early 70s, had gone on the run to Argentina 6 years previously when he had been named and, briefly, arrested in connection with the 1974 Brescia anti-fascist rally bombing mentioned earlier. In Argentina he had been recruited into that country's special services, along with Delle. Known variously as Carlos, Mario Bonomi and Bruno Costas, Chiaie was an accredited coordinator of the Bolivian National Drug Control Agency, a misnomer if there ever was one under Colonel Renaric. Colonel Rick claims that Chiaie came to him with a Bolivian birth certificate and identity card in the company of an official of Department 2 of Bolivian Military Intelligence who insisted he should be accredited to the agency. According to the statement of Supergrass Cialini, who was also an agent of the Bolivian Interior Ministry, Chiaie had been described in CIA documents as a young terrorist torture freak. The CIA blamed him directly for many of the violations of human rights perpetrated under the regime of General Meza. Chiaie's name has also been linked with a number of murders, including that of an ex-policeman, José Abraham Batista, who was gunned down, for an unknown motive, in the Avenida Uruguay in the narco-fascist capital of Santa Cruz de la Sierra, as well as the torture and murder on July 17, 1980 of Marcelo Quiroga Santa Cruz, the Secretary-General of the Bolivian Socialist Party. Page 46, Chapter 6, Bologna. On Saturday, August 2, 1980, the first full day of the Italian national holiday, a massive explosion ripped through the waiting room at Bologna railway station, killing 85 people and seriously injuring and maiming a further 200. Although the people of Italy knew instinctively this was a neo-fascist provocation, the police could come up with no real leads, and 7 days after the outrage the investigation had come to a dead end. The first clue came when a prisoner claimed to have overheard the massacre being planned by his cellmates. Arrest warrants were issued for a number of neo-fascists, but nothing substantial came from this and other leads. Indeed, by December 1980 there were still only 3 suspects, and the evidence against them hinged solely on the statement of a fellow neo-fascist informer, Pier Giorgio Farina. This evidence proved circumstantial, and on April 30, 1981 the investigating magistrate ordered the release of Francisco Ferlotti, the man named by Farina as having been the key planner of the outrage. The other 2 suspects were also released at the end of 1981, again due to insufficient evidence, a decision which shocked most of Italy, not only the relatives of the dead and injured. The investigation was not, however, at a dead end. By mid-April 1982 news of 4 arrests on charges of illegal association and membership of an armed gang, Lita Minetti, Adriano Tilger, Maurizio Giargi, and Carmine Palladino for the first time pointed the finger directly at Stefano Delle. The Masonic connection. In May 1981 the investigation into the Bologna massacre was overshadowed by another scandal which exposed the formalized corruption of the Italian ruling class. It also proved to be inextricably linked with the Bologna inquiry. During a police raid on the Arezzo villa of Licio Gelli, a respected businessman and honorary Argentinian consul, in connection with the investigation into Michele Sindona, the Vatican's financial frontman and embezzler of $45 million from his Franklin National Bank. Police discovered a list of 953 prominent public figures who were members of a Masonic lodge, Propaganda 2 or P2, based in Rome's Hotel Excelsior under the worshipful mastership of Gelli. Further investigations revealed that Gelli was a wanted wartime fascist and had used P2 to establish a conspiratorial network which covered every key sector of the Italian establishment and whose membership included cabinet ministers, newspaper publishers, the heads of television and radio stations, and the heads of the secret services and armed forces. Lodge P2 was in effect the continuation and political extension, in Italy and in Latin America, of the Rose of the Wines organization whose existence had been exposed in 1974. The scandal which followed the disclosure of the existence and membership of Lodge P2 brought down the government of Orlando Forlani, but only 2 members of P2 were ever questioned about any criminal offense: Licio Gelli, and a Secret Service officer who faced charges concerning the passing of classified information. Captain Antonio La Bruna, Stefano Delle's Secret Service shadow, was the officer questioned as to his membership of P2. The full implications of this elaborate secret Masonic network are still unknown, but subsequent revelations by members and events have cast some light on its founding aims. Licio Gelli, who had fled to Argentina where he had lived for many years after the war and where he had many protectors, was arrested in Switzerland in September 1982. Carrying a false passport, he was arrested while attempting to withdraw $120 million from the private account of Roberto Calvi, a member of both P2 and City of London Lodge 901, president of the Banco Ambrosiano, another Vatican conduit. In a statement by fellow P2 brother Michele Sindona to Jeremy Paxman of the BBC Panorama program from a U.S. prison where he is serving 25 years for fraud, the money being raised by both Calvi and Gelli, with the help of the Vatican Bank, was to be used to finance extreme right-wing military regimes in Latin America. These regimes relied heavily on the support of Lodge P2, which saw its main function as coordinating the international activities and attitudes of right-wing anti-communism and which was undoubtedly one of the most effective clandestine power structures forming links between the far right in Europe and in Latin America. Further information as to the insidious nature of Lodge P2 came to light with the arrest in Switzerland of Elio Cialini, a P2 brother, alleged Secret Service agent and card-carrying officer of the Bolivian Interior Ministry. Cialini had been jailed in Switzerland on charges of swindling, kidnapping, and making death threats against a woman by the name of Renata Ball. In the autumn of 1981, from his prison cell in Geneva, Cialini wrote to Aldo Gentile, the magistrate investigating the Bologna railway massacre, claiming he had inside knowledge and was prepared to make a statement. The magistrate eventually traveled to Switzerland and began taking Cialini's deposition in mid-March 1982. Cialini made some remarkable allegations when he began to outline his explanation of the mechanics and reason for the outrage. According to the informer, a huge fraud had been planned in Italy involving the massive Eni Industrial Group, a parastatal corporation which controlled most of Italy's oil, natural gas, and chemical industry and which also subsidized the neo-fascist MSI, and a sum of 50 billion lire. Plans for this massive swindle were, according to Cialini, discussed at a special meeting of Lodge P2 on April 11, 1980 in Monte Carlo. It was decided that Gelli should commission Stefano Delle to organize an action of such spectacular dimensions that governmental and public attention would be diverted away from the financial coup. According to Cialini, Delle and Gelli met at the Sheraton Hotel in Buenos Aires to finalize their plans. Guns and drugs. Whether or not Cialini's allegations were true, and there is considerable doubt about some of them, he was released shortly after giving his statement to the Bologna magistrate. His bail was, according to a letter sent to the chairman of the parliamentary inquiry into the activities of Lodge P2, put up by the Carabinieri or another secret service agency. On his release, Cialini went to see the Bologna magistrates claiming he was passing through on his way to check in at the HQ of his service, Carabinieri Counterintelligence, and made a further deposition concerning drug and arms smuggling rings centered around Lodge P2. He also went into great detail about the organization of the Delle network abroad, particularly in Latin America. As a result of this latest deposition by Cialini, the investigating magistrate issued the warrants for the arrest of Lita Minetti, Carmine Palladino, Adriano Tilger, and Maurizio Giargi. Events began to move quickly. Carmine Palladino, a dedicated disciple and confidant of Stefano Delle, a longtime friend who had acted as a go-between for the fascist leader and his organization in Europe, was cold-bloodedly strangled in prison on August 12, 1982 by another member of the Delle group, Pierluigi Concutelli*, the neo-fascist and would-be assassin of Bernardo Leighton, who was serving a life sentence for the murder of the magistrate Vittorio Accorcio. Concutelli, who immediately admitted responsibility for the murder, claimed he had strangled Palladino because he had been directly responsible for the arrest and death of Giorgio Vale, another member of the Delle network. Footnote: Pierluigi Concutelli, the top assassin for the Delle network, and Mario Tutti, in whose honor the Bologna railway massacre was claimed, had both previously carried out another prison murder. The earlier victim was Erminio Buzzi, a 40-year-old fascist arrested in 1979 for his alleged part in the 1974 Brescia bombing. Buzzi, who was awaiting trial in the top security wing of Novara prison, was the third prisoner to be murdered in Novara in the space of 1 month. End footnote. What is more likely is that Concutelli had been ordered to kill Palladino, who was seen as the weak link in the chain and who could easily incriminate all the other members of the Black Orchestra, particularly his boss, Delle himself. Fear of being indicted on a charge of massacre could move him to tell all he knew of the organization's involvement in a series of compromising events dating back to the attempted coup of General De Lorenzo and the fascist-inspired revolt which rocked Reggio Calabria in 1970. Luxury. Coincidentally, shortly before his murder, Carmine Palladino had been the subject of a series of discussions between the magistrate investigating the Bologna massacre, Aldo Gentile, and journalist Roberto Chiaie. Before Delle's name had been openly linked with the Bologna massacre, Chiaie had turned his attentions to locating the whereabouts of the historic leader of Italian neo-fascism, Stefano Delle. The first person the journalist went to was the terrorist leader's companion, Lita Minetti. A few days after he made his initial contact with Minetti, Chiaie was told to prepare for a long journey. He was then introduced to the person who would escort him to meet Delle, Carmine Palladino. It was not until the two men boarded a plane for Brussels that Chiaie knew where he was going. From Brussels they took a train to Paris, where they booked into a hotel in Montmartre to await the contact. During this journey Chiaie felt he had got to know Palladino fairly well and formed a favorable impression of him. Palladino told the journalist that he first got to know Delle when he was a member of the Quadrero gang in the Rome suburb where Delle was the fascist boss. He swore to Chiaie that he had never gone over the top and added that he had now lost all his original idealism and enthusiasm for the cause, nor did he believe in violence. This loss of enthusiasm was probably also transparent to Delle himself and may well have been a factor in the decision to eliminate his old friend and comrade. Palladino was, however, totally under the charismatic spell of Il Ciccola, as Chiaie was to observe later. He was clearly proud of his personal relationship with Delle, about whom he spoke with great reverence, a man for whom he would clearly have sacrificed much with no hesitation. The call eventually came from Delle's hideout and a meeting was arranged. The Nazi leader was comfortably ensconced in a luxury suite in one of the new hotels in the fashionable Étoile district of Paris. Delle was accompanied everywhere by a bodyguard supplied by his Paris network. Chiaie's interview with Delle lasted 6 hours, during which time Carmine Palladino was present at all times. The relationship between them, as observed by the journalist, appeared to be that of general and adjutant. At one point, while sorting through letters and documents brought by Palladino, Delle became furious with an item referring to a police search of an insurance agency run by another of Delle's close lieutenants, Adriano Tilger. Apparently, the information obtained by the police during this search led to the arrest of numerous members of Terza Posizione, a neo-fascist terrorist organization under Delle's aegis. During the interview, Chiaie noted that Delle ended up claiming a paternity of sorts of the NAR. Before Bologna. The sequence of events leading up to the Bologna massacre on August 2, 1980, according to the testimony of penitent fascist supergrasses such as Elio Cialini and Aldo Tisse, appears to be as follows. Paris, early summer 1980. Delle arrived in Paris from Bolivia, where he met, among others, Carmine Palladino, Alessandro Alibrandi, later safe-housed in England by the League of St. George, and Giuseppe Dimitri. Delle also admits to having been in Cannes during the summer of 1980 on a working holiday, traveling on a Venezuelan passport. Dixmude, Belgium, June. International neo-fascist rally hosted by Flemish Militant Order, VMO, attended by neo-fascists from Italy, France, Spain, the United States and Britain. According to the British anti-fascist magazine Searchlight, a secret meeting was held in Bruges to discuss clandestine activities such as the exchange of personnel to effect jobs in each other's countries and the establishing of an escape network and the setting up of a network of safe houses for neo-fascists on the run. The British neo-fascist organisation, the League of St. George, undertook to provide cover for wanted neo-fascists. Rome, June 26. Pierluigi Paglia and Maurizio Giargi arrived on a flight from Buenos Aires where they meet up with 3 other mercenaries in a hotel, Frenchman Olivier Danet and 2 West Germans, Joachim Fiebelkaum and Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, leader of the West German terrorist group which bore his name. Abruzzi, Italy, mid-July. Campo Hobbit, third camp of its kind, inspired by the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien, attracted over 2,000 neo-fascists including many subsequently implicated in the Bologna massacre. Inspector Paul Durand, a French security policeman and founder member of the French neo-fascist FAIN, allegedly set up with assistance from Delle, visited Bologna on holiday with another Delle associate, Marco Affedigato, and a group of other unidentified neo-fascists shortly before the bombing. It would appear Durand was being set up by the Italians. In Bologna Durand met Francisco Donini, founder of the Italian National Socialist Union and the Fiume Liberation Organization, who arranged for him to meet other extreme right-wingers, including Franco Frida's lawyer. In a statement to French police investigators, Durand has since voiced his doubts. What still surprises me is that Donini wanted me to check into a hotel right opposite the Bologna railway station. But he knew it was too expensive for me. Durand then travelled on to Perugia for a meeting with Hugo Cesarini of the National Labour Party, then to Rome for further meetings with MSI members, then on to Campo Hobbit for the fascist festivities. Also present at the Campo Hobbit celebrations were Augusto Cacci, Mario Tutti, Luciano Franci, and Pierre Malantacchi, all members of the Delle network, and the latter 3 accused of involvement in the 1974 Italicus train bombing. From Bologna to Beirut. Following the carnage of the Bologna railway station and the subsequent investigation into the extreme right, neo-fascist terrorists in Italy went underground. According to informer Walter Sordi *, who spent 2 years as a fugitive in France, the first to get out were Stefano Procopio, Fabrizio de Iori, Alessandro Alibrandi, and Sordi himself. Footnote. On the New Odessa, Sorda has made statements concerning the existence of a possibly Paris-based clandestine clearinghouse for wanted fascists which also acts as a mercenary recruitment agency, echoes of the Paladin organization. Sorda has told Italian magistrates of the case of one fascist, Carlo da Silla, wanted for a robbery attributed to the NAR, who was recruited through this agency to fight for the Afghan Liberation Army. End footnote. These made their getaway on the now well-organized escape lines by plane from Rome to Athens on false passports, by ship from Athens to Cyprus, and then the final journey to Beirut, where they were assured of a warm welcome. As soon as the 4 neo-fascists landed in Lebanon, they were escorted to a Christian Phalangist military training camp where, according to Sordi, they made us an allowance of 300,000 lire monthly, enough to live on. They taught us how to use heavy arms, bazookas, machine guns, and we learned how to put bombs together and how explosives should be handled. In return for this hospitality and training, the fascists were occasionally asked along to take part in attacks on military bases of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Sorda's statement concerning the Christian Phalangist backing for the Italian neo-fascists was supported later when a PLO guerrilla group captured some Germans returning from the Maronite Christian part of Beirut. Held and questioned, the Germans admitted having spent some time in the Phalangist training camp at Accra. We also met about a dozen Italians there, they claimed. In August 1981, a year after the Bologna bombing, Searchlight magazine announced that Italian neo-fascists wanted for questioning in connection with the massacre had all been found safe houses and cover in Britain. The British end of the New Odessa escape network was apparently proposed and organised by Stephen Brady of the League of St. George during the previous year's Dixmude rally. After leaving Beirut, Alibrandi had travelled to London, where he was seen by Searchlight's informer at a League of St. George social at the Oak Tree Public House in Acton, London. Throughout the evening Alibrandi and other Italians were in the company of both Stephen Brady and Mike Griffin, membership secretary of the League of St. George. The following month a further 7 Italians were arrested in London in connection with the Bologna massacre. Although the few who were employed were in poorly paid catering jobs, they were found to be in possession of substantial sums of money. One had £2,000. However, the extradition request was turned down by London magistrates because of the poor quality of the evidence put forward by the Italian authorities, and all were allowed to remain in Britain. British police apparently believed that up to 23 other wanted neo-fascist fugitives were also hiding in Britain. Footnote. The importance of Britain as a refuge for the Italian neo-Nazi right is underlined by the continuing attempts by Giovanni Ventura, the Italian Secret Service agent most directly implicated in the 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing, to obtain political asylum in this country on his release from custody in Argentina. Another member of the Delle network, Luciano Petroni, was arrested on an international warrant in London on January 24, 1983. Petroni was held on an extradition request from the Italian police, who wanted to question him in connection with the murder of 2 policemen in Rome in June 1982. Spanish police also wanted to question him in regard to a bank robbery in Marbella which netted an estimated £10 million from safe deposit boxes. Among those attending the Petroni extradition hearings as observers were 3 of the young Italian neo-fascists previously held on extradition warrants in connection with terrorist charges in Italy. End footnote. Sometime in 1981 Alessandro Alibrandi returned secretly to Italy, where he was shot dead in a gun battle with police that December. The News Titans. On Friday, September 10, 1982, the Bologna investigating magistrate, Aldo Gentile, issued an international warrant for the arrest of 5 men alleged to be perpetrators of the outrage 2 years previously. He told reporters, the man who was carrying the suitcase containing the explosives is among them. The 5 were, Olivier Danet, 28-year-old French mercenary with extreme right-wing connections, involved in arms and drug smuggling, and a member of the Bolivian Fiancés of Death, alleged to be the man who prepared the Bologna station bomb. Joachim Fiebelkorn, the German mercenary and fiancé of Death. Maurizio Giorgi Pirlas, Guy Pagliai, Stefano Delle. Of the 5, only Giorgi was already in custody on other charges. Danet was arrested by French police shortly afterwards. Fiebelkorn gave himself up to West German police in Frankfurt on the Monday after the arrest warrant was issued and was released on bail within 40 hours. While he was in custody, Fiebelkorn made a lengthy statement concerning his work for Delle as a security advisor in Bolivia. This was the statement naming Stefano Delle as the main conduit between the Latin American drug producers and the Sicilian mafia. Page 52, Chapter 7, Hunting in Bolivia. Exactly 1 month after the warrant was issued, on October 10, the military dictatorship of General Luis Garcia Meza was obliged to hand over power to the civilian government of Dr. Siles Zuazo. The junta's strongman, Interior Minister Colonel Luis Arce Gomez, aware that the days of his power were rapidly coming to an end, had already arranged to have himself accredited as military attaché to the Bolivian embassy in Buenos Aires, and on October 4, 1 week before the elections, he crossed the frontier with a convoy of 5 cars and an immense personal fortune. Both Arce Gomez and Garcia Meza were later, unsurprisingly, given political asylum in Argentina, the country which had originally helped them attain power, and permitted to travel in cars without number plates and with their own armed bodyguards. The Italian authorities had been waiting for this moment. Italian Secret Service agents had apparently been hot on the trail of Delle in Bolivia and Argentina for some months previously, and when the news came of the election of the new president of Bolivia, they moved immediately to spring the trap. At 20:00 hours GMT on Saturday, October 9, 1982, an Alitalia DC-10, chartered under mysterious circumstances, left Rome's Fiumicino airport bound for La Paz. On board were 12 Italian Secret Service officers and anti-terrorist policemen. With the full cooperation of the newly elected Bolivian government, the Italians organized an operation for the arrest of Delle and Pagliai, which bore little similarity to the capture by Israeli agents of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires 20 years previously. Whereas Eichmann was snatched from under the noses of his Argentinian hosts and bundled aboard an El Al plane, for the attempted capture of Pagliai, special squads of Bolivian security forces surrounded Pagliai's house in the garrison town of Santa Cruz de la Sierra, the drug capital of Latin America and the bastion of the leading right-wing party of Bolivia, the Falange Socialista Boliviana, the inner core of Bolivian reaction. Pugliese was found to be not at home, however, and so the security forces awaited his return from the Puerto Banderas province where he was reported to have been with a group of hunters. At midday on Sunday, October 10, Pugliese, the young terrorist torture freak, drove into the Plaza Nuestra Señora de Fatima, and the police moved in to surround his jeep. In the gunfight which ensued, Pugliese received a bullet in his neck which lodged in his spinal cord. Pugliese was unfortunate. He had been making preparations to follow Garcia Meza and Ars Gomez from Bolivia and return to his home base in Argentina, with his Argentinian wife and their child. According to the Italian daily Corriere della Sera, he had the previous week transferred $15 million to his bank account in Argentina. He was operated on at Santa Cruz and taken to La Paz on the Alitalia DC-10, and then, after the granting of extradition, to Rome where he arrived on October 13 in a coma. He recovered consciousness but remained paralyzed in all four limbs, eventually dying in a Rome hospital 24 days after his forced repatriation. It is not known what if anything he said of Delle. Delle escapes. Of Delle, the main target of the international manhunt, there was no sign. Once again he had lived up to his name of untouchable. It is entirely within the bounds of probability that he was forewarned of the search for him by well-wishers in the Italian, American, or Argentinian secret services and so made good his escape. It is also entirely within his character that he should have allowed Pugliese to walk into the trap or indeed have sent him into it to save his own skin. As usual with Delle, there are a number of contradictory reports as to the manner of his escape. Some say he escaped from Santa Cruz to Argentina on October 10 with other members of the Bolivian military regime. According to a report in the Venezuelan daily El Nacional, Delle escaped using the name Alfredo Modugno, an assumed name by which he had been registered as a participant at the First Ibero-American Congress of Democratic Journalists scheduled to start the very day the military regime fell. Other reports have Delle escaping across the Peruvian border near Puno on October 11 under the name Mario Esposito and accompanied by 3 bodyguards. On December 22, 1982, Delle issued a press statement, from hiding, to the Italian ANSA news agency announcing a warning to the new government of Bolivia and the world. He stated that there was already being created a civil-military junta to take full advantage of the sharp contradictions among the components of the democratic process begun the previous October 10 and to capture power. According to the La Paz Daily, Meridiano, which carried the story, this is the first time the Black Pimpernel, their description, had been heard of since the failure of the security operation to catch him over 2 months earlier. The paper goes on to say there is no reason to disbelieve in the existence of this clandestine junta. The fascist terrorist who until recently lived in Bolivia states that the subversive international has ample possibilities because the revolutionary movement is now connected with many political sectors, including those with differential doctrinarial aspirations. Presumably this is an attempt to raise the specter of so-called opposing extremisms again. Why do the Americans, French, and Israelis search for him and his comrades hiding in Bolivia? To understand this, he says, one has to talk about what we were doing in Bolivia. In 1980, Bolivian comrades asked us to give direct support to the revolution which would bring the military to power. It was in this way that Vanguardia Nacional took part, as it had in Costa Rica, Spain, Angola, Portugal, Chile, El Salvador, and Argentina. We were not present in a mercenary role but rather as political militants who knew how to win esteem and respect. Our activities unleashed a series of international maneuvers aimed at thwarting this process of winning influence which confirmed the value and worth, pragmatic, of our ideas and our political projects. According to Delle, the Americans are looking for him because he and his comrades opposed the pressures of the USA. The American ambassador behaved as though Bolivia was a province of his empire, to destroy the cocoa plantations. Those wicked Zionists. The French, went on Delle, were after him for another reason. We tore up a pre-contract signed between France and Bolivia in 1979 for the exploration and exploitation of uranium resources. The contract had a clause which was too advantageous to France. As for the persecution by the Israelis, Delle explained, we are constantly working to explain to the Bolivians the methods and objectives of international Zionism. Remembering that the government of Hernan Siles Zuazo decreed his expulsion, he said, there are some sectors who want to capture me, preferably dead. With me, it won't be an easy job. They look for us, but we are on the lookout for them. Speaking of the present situation, the government is in the hands of minor Marxist elements. The economic difficulties and the social conflict are assuming proportions which have no precedent. Now a clandestine civil-military junta has been organized which hopes to rebuild on such sharp contradictions, a power which represents the real interests of the Bolivian people. Wherever Delle is hiding, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, Guatemala, El Salvador, Venezuela, Colombia, or Peru, he will certainly re-emerge at some time in the future to serve the interests of a power elite capable of any act, no matter how horrific, in the pursuit of its global objectives of subverting all forms of political dissent and all genuine movements for social progress. The final word on Delle in this present work lies with the repentant ex-head of the neo-fascist terrorist infrastructure, Aldo Tase. Delle may be the shadowy figure of right-wing subversion. He is one of that breed of individuals who purport to be steadfast revolutionaries but in fact have 3 or 4 different faces. In the history of terrorism one finds people who assume their full share of responsibility and sign their statements, and these are dubbed rogues. And there are others who have for years and do still strive to assume a pure status that they have never enjoyed. By now their role is clear, theirs is the role of prize spies. Page 55. Chapter 8, Conclusion. Shortly after being condemned to death for war crimes in 1946, the Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg declared, "Within 15 years we will begin to be talked about again, and within 20 years Nazism will again be a force." Rosenberg's prophecy did come true, but not in quite the way he imagined it. The history of neo-fascism over the past 20 years, as seen through the story of Stefano Delle and his colleagues of the Black Orchestra, gives us a clear indication of their true role, agents of an inner, oligarchic power sphere which sets itself above all law and morality. The account of Stefano Delle's involvement in the events described in the previous pages has been drawn from a wide variety of sources, some honest and some highly suspect. Stefano Delle himself vehemently denies all the allegations made against him concerning the Piazza Fontana, Italicus, and Bologna bombings, the various coup d'état attempts, or any connection with the Italian Secret Service, the SID. When interviewed by Italian journalist Enzo Biaggi in January 1983 on the edge of the Amazonian rainforest, Stefano Delle recounted the conversation between him and Captain Antonio La Bruna when discussing the SID's plan to spring Frida and Ventura from prison and, with Delle's assistance, safe-house them in Spain before finding them haven in Latin America. La Bruna then began to describe the situation in Italy, adding that it was the time to strike back and that we were indispensable to that operation. He said one thing that stuck in my mind. He said, "Some SID people are convinced that you have connections with the Interior Ministry, while others are not." I said to him, "How come?" "Because," he answered, "you have never contacted us." My answer to that was that I held that the National Revolutionary Movement was not a prize to be disputed between the Interior Ministry and the SID. That's the only contact I have had with the SID, and it was severed immediately, so much so that La Bruna has been one of my fiercest accusers. And, of course, this shows that I had had no contacts with the SID, as had Giannettini for example. Whether or not Stefano Delle was directly responsible for the outrages and terrorist activities ascribed to him is a matter for conjecture. However, there are sufficient attendant circumstances and statements to directly and inferentially place Delle as a key figure in the events described in previous pages, though the extent to which he was or is a willing or unwitting agent of others may never be known. But there are more important considerations. Lessons relying on intimidation. The reactionaries forget that they will cause more indignation, more hatred, more thirst for martyrdom, than real fear. They only intimidate the weak, they exasperate the best forces and temper the resolution of the strongest. Victor Serge, what everyone should know about state oppression. The aim of this study in black terrorism has not been to establish the guilt of Stefano Delle or present him as an evil genius controlling a vast international network of thugs and terrorists. Nor yet is it an expose of the nonsensical but sinister selectivity of the Western media in presenting the quantitatively and qualitatively lesser Marxist and nationalist terrorist groups as the agents of Soviet destabilization cumulatively eroding the foundations of democracy. The primary aim has been to underline the real dangers of fascism in the hope that useful lessons can be drawn from the experiences of the past 20 years. Fascists are the subordinate element of more cohesive and powerful forces which are the real backbone of any violent reactionary movement. These forces can be identified within certain sectors of the economic, political, military, and religious bureaucracies and organized crime. A coalition of all or some of these elements at any one time can provide the basis for a scenario in which the neo-fascists and other reactionary elements can be called on to play what they see as their assigned historic role. Having failed to win power through the ballot box, believers in National Socialism must turn to other methods. In a recent article in his occasional publication Gothic Ripples, British fascist strategist Colin Jordan says, "For us the days of the political party as a primitive means of political action are now finished and gone forever. This political isolation, and their obsessive anti-communism which extends inevitably against all dissent and all rival political standpoints, together with their predisposition to violence and covert action, places them in a position whereby they can easily be manipulated, however unwittingly, by external interests. The infrastructure and friendship networks of the extreme right internationally are such that the fascists and organized crime are in effect assets of clandestine state agencies who, in the intelligence parlance, are both plausibly deniable and can, in the same parlance, respond to a crisis without transgressions of administrative jurisdictions in order to neutralize troublesome dissidents, or even, indeed, political opponents seemingly more powerful than themselves, e.g., J.F. Kennedy. Or safeguard and enhance the investment climate. Although the attempt by the Italian neo-fascists to infiltrate the extra-parliamentary left, in particular the anarchist groups, was ultimately unsuccessful, inasmuch as it was eventually exposed, it did underline that the anarchists, because of their negative symbolic value and a confusing variety of tendencies, were considered easy prey for short-term manipulation. However, anarchist structures tend to reveal their infiltrators rapidly, as they are thin or transparent. More structured movements may conceal traitors indefinitely. The more rigid the structure, the easier it is to remain undetected, as one simply carries out orders. It is important to stress that although the strategy of provocation and tension has counter-revolutionary aims which depend upon producing certain conditions, i.e., political and economic destabilization, that does not necessarily make those conditions counter-revolutionary. We must be careful to distinguish between real provocation and genuine resistance and avoid fueling the arguments of those who criticize and oppose all resistance on the grounds that it causes repression. As Victor Serge noted in What Everyone Should Know About State Repression, the intrigues of power elites only reveal their corruption and contribute in no small measure to their eventual downfall. Provocation acquires growing importance in proportion as the regimes it serves go into decline and enter onto the slippery slope to oblivion. It is the curse of decomposing regimes. Provocation is much more dangerous in terms of the distrust it sows friends and comrades. Suspicion and mistrust among us can only be reduced and isolated by more reliance not just on tighter, but also on more tested local affinity groups who are united by shared activity and working together, rather than mere adherence to a common program or platform. If we are to avoid another Chile or Bolivia or prevent future massacres such as the Piazza Fontana or Bologna railway station, it is imperative that we are able to recognize and counter the intrigues and maneuvers of covert political elites in their attempts to quash political dissent and, ultimately, impose totalitarian methods of social control. We hope the present work goes some way towards furthering our understanding of the methods of the modern-day Dr. Caligari and the nature of the zombie in his cabinet. Finally, it cannot be stressed too often that it is the working class against whom the fascist terror is ultimately aimed and from the working class that the only final resistance can come. Given the contradictory trends towards greater and greater state power on the one hand and greater demands for the democratization of everyday social life on the other, it is inevitable that the strong-arm tactics of the state should be carried out by plausibly deniable agents apparently, by their anti-parliamentary stance, unconnected with the moderate center/consensus, since any clear connection would destroy the democratic facade of the state and the semi-benign image of the economic institutions it serves. Since society continues to rest on wage slavery, which ultimately denies the vast majority of its members any say in their own destiny, individual or collective, things cannot be otherwise.